Hi, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism, or IORT, at Utah State University, we welcome you to the 7th of 9 sessions of the Red Emerald Resilience Training Program. I am Jordan Catcher, Initiatives Facilitator with the Wallace Stegner Center Environmental Dispute Resolution Program at the University of Utah. I am an IORT partner, and I'll be facilitating today's session. To start us off, we want to highlight that this training series is supported by the Utah Office of Tourism's Destination Development and Partner Relations team. Also, we want to give you a little bit of a background for the Red Emerald Resilience Training Series. So as many of you may know, probably all too well, the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in serious economic setbacks and challenges for the tourism industry and many destination communities throughout Utah and across the nation. Many businesses and tourism organizations are still recovering and/or learning how to adapt to this post-pandemic world. To address this need, the Utah Office of Tourism and IORT came together to build this webinar training series with the purpose of helping Utah's tourism industry and local businesses recover from COVID-19 and become more resilient to future shocks. We consulted with industry leaders and business owners throughout the state via interviews and a survey, and we used what we heard via that consultation to inform the creation of this series. The topics and the design of the training sessions reflect what we heard was most important. Our ultimate hope in conducting this training series is that through sharing best practices and strategies, lessons learned, and success stories, we can help Utah's tourism industry and businesses thrive in an ever-changing world. So for the full training program, we would love you to visit our website, which I'm going to post directly into our chat. The training series that we are doing is organized into 3 segments. So the first segment focused on communication for resilience, the second focused on resources for resilience, and the third is on planning for resilience. So today's session will begin the final segment on planning for resilience, and we will be focusing on strategies for providing affordable housing for tourism industry employees. As with all of our sessions, this session is particularly targeted toward people working in and with the tourism industry. However, we do expect today's content will be relevant for really anyone that's interested in this topic. So today, we are joined by 4 special guests who will be discussing this topic and sharing their wisdom with us. David O'Connor, Executive Director with Big Sky Community Housing Trust, Seana Doherty, Senior Manager with Agnew Beck Consulting, Kaitlin Myers, Executive Director with Moab Area Community Land Trust, and Leah Olson, Community Outreach Coordinator and Program Facilitator with Community Rebuilds. Each of our speakers brings a unique perspective and possibilities that we hope will help you all with planning for recovery and resilience. So our speakers will join us in just a moment. For now, I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today and sharing your wisdom with us. So for the audience, we have a few important things to note. This session is being recorded. We will share the session recording along with a webinar summary via our website after the event. In a moment, we're also going to jump right into more of the interactive part of the presentation. And throughout the session, those of you on the live webinar should expect to engage. So this is how it's going to work. We want to hear how things are going for you and what you're thinking about. So we will be presenting some questions for you to respond to throughout the presentation. We will post those prompts for the audience using the chat function. So please respond to any prompts in the chat. If you have specific questions for the panelists during the presentation, please post your question using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll address those questions if and as we have time. So to recap, we're going to use the Q&A function to submit your questions for panelists, and we'll use the chat function when responding to our questions and prompts. Also, when responding to prompts via the chat, just make sure that when you do actually submit your response, that it's going to everyone or all presenters and participants. So, okay, to start us off, let's kind of give this chat engagement a try and try to get some input from the audience first. So for the audience, we're going to want you to type a response in your chat. Remember to make sure that it's going out to everyone, and then we hope that you'll share your thoughts with all of us as this goes through. So we're going to start out with our first prompt, and I'm going to throw it into the chat, which is asking all of you, so what community do you live in or work with? And what is the state of housing for tourism industry employees in that community? So I encourage you to take a moment and throw your responses into the chat. We'd love to see who's joining us today. Thank you.
Jordan, it looks like the chat feature is currently disabled. I'm going to fix that right now.
Thank you, Liz.
1 second. Okay, that should be enabled for everyone now. My apologies.
Thank you, Liz. I'm going to throw this chat just right back in just in case you all weren't able to see it initially. So again, the community that you live in, work with, and the state of housing for tourism industry employees in that community. We've got Salt Lake, Bryce Canyon, Lake Tahoe. Very challenging. We've got Torrey, Twilla, Green River, Hanksville, Springdale. Look at all these. This is awesome. Nevada City, Cedar City, Kanab, Boise. Very unaffordable, overpriced, extremely challenging. Seeing a lot of challenging responses here. A lot of small gateway communities throughout. Tons of, oh wow, we've got Maine in here too. Durango, cool. Boulder, Utah, wonderful. Thank you all so much for throwing in these responses. These are incredible. And yeah, it definitely talks about the complexities of these issues that you all are facing in your communities. Lovely. Okay, so while you all are thinking about that and submitting your responses, we'd also love to throw in another prompt too to kind of practice more of this exercise. And so in the prompt, for the chat, I'm going to ask you all, what is one thing that you're hoping to get out of today's webinar? Like what brought you here? Are you looking for particular things? Are you excited to just see what resources are out there? We're really curious about, what brought you here today? So available resources on housing, innovative ideas and resources, best practices. Yeah, what's everybody doing? Strategies for working with other communities, wanting to learn from each other. Yeah, lessons learned, like what's worked and what hasn't. How to talk to community members and businesses about housing. Thinking about a combined comprehensive statewide effort, policy ideas. How to be inexpensive yet attractive. How to get around NIMBYism. Ooh, these are all really, really great insights. And I would encourage our presenters to kind of rip off of anything that they're seeing in the chat and really reflecting the themes from that too. Oh, that's great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. You all did so great with the engagement process and sharing your insights. And as we kind of segue into this panel discussion, I just want you all to know that you can still absolutely keep using the chat as well. And so with that, thank you all so much for your engagement. I'm going to invite our panelists to join us now. So panelists, if you could, please turn on your cameras and welcome. Hi. So before we dive in, I would love to give the audience a chance to just learn a little bit more about each of our speakers. So panelists, in around 1 or 2 minutes, I would love if you could introduce yourselves and include an overview of how you've worked on housing for tourism industry employees. So with that, Leah, I'm going to have you go first.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me join you today. My name is Leah Olson. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator and Program Facilitator with Community Rebuilds. Community Rebuilds is a nonprofit, 501c3 based out of Moab. And I come from housing, from a policy and public service and social work background, and came to Community Rebuilds to really help build a workforce housing in the Moab area. The main part of our mission is to build sustainable housing for the local workforce. As many of you know, I saw a lot of Utah, a lot of Southwest locations come up on the map. And so as many of you know, we have a lot of beautiful parks and landmarks around the area. So about 60% of the area workforce is tourism based. So we have a lot of folks who, like many of your own communities, are priced out of the area. So we support the tourism-based employees through providing an affordable pathway to home ownership. Our homeowners have lived in Moab for around 2 years, 2+ years, and are low and very low income. We help them from start to finish with the build process, through loan processing and all parts of the build. And our organization was founded in 2010, and we've built 52 homes to date, with another 8 that are set to be completed in the next few weeks. So that's a little bit about us, and I'll get more into kind of our program later on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. David, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Jordan. And thanks everyone for being here today. My name is David O'Connor. I'm the executive director of the Big Sky Community Housing Trust in Big Sky, Montana. We're just south of Bozeman, just outside of Yellowstone Park in southwest Montana. And we're largely a resort community, a ski area, and proximity to Yellowstone. And I kind of wear a triple citizenship because I was a business owner for many years, worked in hospitality, had a hotel restaurant here in town with about 36 units of on-site employee housing. We had about 100 employees total, so I'm certainly acquainted with that perspective of it. I spent many years as president of the Big Sky Chamber of Commerce and have sort of experienced that end of it. And for the past year or so, I've been the executive director at the Big Sky Community Housing Trust. And our organization's about 3 years old, 4 years old. We started in conjunction with our local Human Resources Development Council in Bozeman, embarking on building a project of 53 deed restricted townhomes here in Big Sky. And so we built those and sold them, and in the process formed our own organization and are at work on a variety of projects and programs. We do a few different things, trying to reach across, we've all seen that kind of rainbow graphic across the AMI spectrum, and we're doing our best because we are, of course, pretty late to the game. So we're doing our best to try to impact each part of that little rainbow as much as we possibly can, between building, which is longer term, but then some of our programs we've been able to roll out for deed restrictions and for rent assistance, for example, have been really successful to help us. And we're in a little bit of a unique environment. Montana actually specifically disallows several of the traditional tools for us. So we've kind of had to find some other ways to put stakeholders together at the table. So look forward to talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Seana, would you like to go next?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Seana Doherty with Agnew Beck. So I'm based in Truckee, California, about 13 miles from Lake Tahoe and about 35 miles from Reno, and the backyard to millions of people in the Bay Area. So we are a resort town, but definitely the preferred vacation spot for much of Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. So it's really impacted our housing market. Agnew Beck is a Alaska-based consulting firm. It's been around for 20 years. We have offices in Truckee and Boise, and we work with a range of partners on community housing solutions, most recently in Ketchum and Whitefish, and Girdwood, Alaska, and then we worked in Bozeman and Mammoth Lakes. And part of my background in housing is I worked for the town of Truckee for 2 years to help them set up a new housing program there. So have sort of that, though I'm in consulting and doing sort of broader partner planning with communities, I spent 2 years on the very detailed implementation side of things. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that and wait till we get to sort of topics and questions.
Thank you so much, Seana. And last but certainly not least, Kaitlin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Happy to go last to introduce myself. I am also from Moab. I'm the executive director of the Moab Area Community Land Trust. I started this position in January of this year. I'm the first paid staff person. We, as an organization, are kind of starting in a non-traditional way. We started with land and then hired staff 3 years later. So we're learning a lot as we go, and we are a new organization. We're currently building out a 300 unit subdivision just south of downtown Moab. We are not acting as developers ourselves. We are working with development partners in our community to build out housing of the subdivision, including community rebuild. So I'm just as excited about these 8 homes that CR is about to finish, because that is at our community land trust property called Arroyo Crossing. Before this, I worked for the city and county here for several years, working in the planning department of the county on affordable housing projects and policies, creating an affordable housing plan, passing several new ordinances that we can talk about later today. And then I also was a project manager for Moab City, working on the redevelopment of a dilapidated trailer park in town. So I have worked in housing both on the public local government side, and now I'm on the nonprofit side. So thanks.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Ooh, I'm so excited. Okay, let's jump into the questions. Okay, before we kind of get into all the weeds of everything, let's frame up the situation for everyone. So I have 2 kind of big questions. So one is, why do we need to talk about providing affordable housing for tourism industry employees? Like, what is the challenge, and how is this kind of playing out in our destination communities? Seana, I'm going to have you kick the conversation off, and then I encourage others to chime in if that works. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jordan. So I think we've all seen the signs on restaurants and store shops this summer and the last couple of years that businesses have had to close days or early because they can't hire staff. In every town that we work in, we see those signs on the door as a symbol of the housing issue. And so I believe that we can all agree that we've gotten to a point where the problem is simply just too big and it requires every single business, public agency, even community members to pay attention and ask themselves the question, what can I do to be part of the solution here? And so I think, to frame it up, we're at a point where the problem is too big for one entity or one agency or one flow of funding to solve alone, and it really requires a partnership approach and all hands on deck. Really, it bleeds into impacting our economy and our environment, and so it's really critical to why we all work and live in these places.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that. I think that we have all been working in this field. We know that this has been an issue even before the pandemic. I think that the pandemic, we all as resort communities are really vulnerable, kind of being a one-track economy. Once people left, that really opened a lot of people's eyes, both on the public and the private sector, of how much everything is interconnected. Tourism is connected to the economy, housing is connected to the economy. So we saw that before, but I think through initiatives such as this webinar, this is coming to the forefront like we've never seen it before. I think nationwide this is an issue, but it feels really critical in resort communities because there's such limited stock in the first place.
I would add to that too, for our community, we're unique in the sense that we are unincorporated. We're about 5,000 full-time year-round residents, but we're one of the few ski resorts where there was not a town here first. So we lack some of that infrastructure, which has been good and bad. It's caused us to develop a lot of those municipal resources from the ground up through special districts and nonprofits and so on. But the way I try to communicate that around our community is that a housing problem for us is a future leadership problem, because the nature of our community requires service from its citizens on all these different boards and districts and so on. And our last May election, for example, we had 8 of those positions running, and all 8 ran unopposed, from school district to water district to resort tax and so on. And that is, to me, what I try to make more of a convincing argument to those in the community that might not feel they're directly affected with workforce housing. is that they are, because that's who serves on our school boards. That's who serves on our leads our fire department and all of those other different organizations. And that, in even just the medium term, we're really suffering from that now, because that whole generation that moved here in their 20s over the past 10 years has left because they can't afford to live here. And so now we're really struggling to get some of those positions filled. So I try to make the point that it's not just an economic development problem, and it's certainly not just an employer's problem. This is very much a community problem for us to grow in the healthy way that we'd like our community to be.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate that insight. I think that starts to bridge into the question of what you want your fabric of your community to look like, and what steps are you going to take now that might pay off in currently, but also in 10, 20, 30 years, is that long-term outlook for sustainability in your local economy, and just trying to create a healthy community.
Thank you all. It seems like one of the key things that we're kind of hearing is this importance on collaboration in addressing tourism industry employee housing concerns, right? So thinking about how people can really come together, and it's not just this one entity or one funding stream that will really kind of solve all of it. David, I'd be curious if you could go first and just kind of talking about what collaboration looks like and maybe the experiences that you've had so far.
Sure, I'd love to. I think collaboration starts with convincing all the different stakeholders that everybody has a role to play. And for us, that's, again, the conversation kind of started with workforce housing, and the early parts of the conversations kind of had statements like, this is the employer's problem, or employers should take care of that. And one of our first orders of business was to really try to dispel that and make everybody understand that we really have shared interests, not always shared goals and not always shared resources, but that's the beauty of collaboration, is trying to understand that each of these different sectors of our community has a very distinct role to play and has a set of resources to bring, and not all of those resources are financial. So our water system, for example, we don't have a municipality, so we don't have tax abatements and things like that we can bring, also because of Montana law, but we are in control of our municipal water, our city, our local water system, so to speak. So we were able to work with our water district and gain control of some water tie-in rights to be dedicated toward workforce housing. So that let us come to the table with developers, not trying to compete with them, but to try to bring a resource that they didn't have. And we try to look to all the different parts of the community so that we can work together to affect something and let everybody stay in their individual roles, right? A developer is to develop and to make a return, and employers, they're trying to create a workforce to provide the services that they're shooting to provide, and we're trying to develop the community in a way that we want. And so I think part of it was when we tried to quit getting people outside of their roles and tell developers that they needed to be community building, and tell the community that they needed to be involved in land acquisition and so on. And so tried to align better the resources with the individual roles so that we could all be bringing something to the table that was more natural for us to get to a common goal. Started off that way.
Thank you, David. And yeah, I know, Seana, you'd also mentioned this idea of like partnership frameworks. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about this and why you think it might be a good approach?
Yeah, and before I dive in, because I was going to say a lot of the same thing that David was going to say, I just have a little bit of a graphic to show you. But part of what I heard in the chat is sort of, housing is a pretty overwhelming topic, and trying to understand where you start. And I'm not going off your question, but it really, I'm a big fan of using a word called community housing because we all live in sort of, a lot of the geographies that I saw listed in the chat are, expensive towns, communities with expensive real estate because of their desirability for recreation. And so when we're forming a partnership and a collaboration, key to that is building a vocabulary that everyone understands. Everyone is coming to housing with a different set of emotions and data, and key to moving any kind of initiative forward is building a common language and common vocabulary to describe your problem. So we have, on one side, we have traditional affordable, which is low income. Usually you get some kind of tax credit subsidy from the state, and it's restricted based on your income. And then in all of our communities, we also have a great need in that middle bracket for people that make too much to afford the lower income, and then not enough to get into the market rate housing. So we call that sort of range community housing. And when you broaden the vocabulary you're using and you name the issue, it's easier to bring your partners to the table, because then they see where they fit in. And so I guess I'm just doing a little bit of the backstory before, the work of bringing partners, and kind of piggybacking on what David said is, speaking to your partners about what their role is, sort of their secret sauce that they bring to the table, and getting them to understand what seat at the table that they are best at, and then that they really need everyone there to really create this wide range of solutions in that community housing framework. So I was just gonna share. I don't know if so I'm gonna just share a visual of that. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay. So again, simple, right? It's great to talk about collaboration. It's great to talk about shared goals, but sort of when you're out talking to your different members, first, obviously having a shared vision, a lot of times that's based on like a set of data on what your needs are, but what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to create more apartments? Are we trying to create employee housing? Are we trying to create J1 housing? Like naming what the issue is and what you're trying to do is key to bringing all of your different partners together. And every community looks different, but this is just sort of a standard way you start talking about like where you fit in and why you're important. Then we get into working with communities on sort of, okay, that's great conceptually, but what does it mean? Like we already have people here working on things. So I don't know what my role is. And, a lot of times organizations have multiple roles, but what you do is you start to, down the left side is sort of like examples of partners, nonprofits, the groups that provide the direct services to the tenants in the homes, tenant rights, application to apartments, community members, government and public agencies, businesses, the developers, and then housing authorities, and then private investment or the foundations, for example. And then they start to see that this is the tapestry of roles. And again, every community is different, but we find that if all of these existed, which would be the dream, in a community, you start to really see the solutions moving forward. Conversely, like in our region, the Taco Truckee region, we don't have anyone that's doing this. There's a whole gap in this deed restriction and this deed stewardship. And because of that, it doesn't, we're going to have a problem once we create the inventory, who's going to manage those deed restrictions. So it just also shows your gaps. And I'm going to stop talking, and I'll share this with the group.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Shauna. That's a really cool resource to kind of figure out, like, yeah, there are things that are happening. So how do they line up and who fits where? And we've already been hearing a couple of times about this idea of, what roles do people play when talking about addressing these housing concerns. And I'm really curious about what kind of examples there might be of what roles different entities have played, and like how different parties can contribute to being part of this like problem-solving enterprise. Kaitlin, would you like to start us out with kind of exploring that question?
Absolutely. I loved that graphic. I would love to have that graphic from you, Shauna, because it really is such a visual, and even thinking about the backgrounds and the people that are on this webinar right now, we're all coming from different backgrounds. David worked in the private sector. I worked in the local government sector. Sean's worked in consulting and government, and we're all wearing multiple hats right now in this webinar, but also have worn multiple hats in our past. And I think that just goes to show that the role that everyone plays in housing is dynamic. It's going to change. It probably is multiple different hats. In Moab, we have local government coming to the table, as well as businesses. And our Chamber of Commerce, we have a local housing task force that kind of groups all of these agencies together to work work towards a common goal, towards that strategic plan that Seana was talking about. I know that there's the Mountain Housing Council, there are other organizations like this throughout resort communities in the Intermountain West. And so I think that it's easier to get into a group like that in order to figure out your role, to find out, you know, what's the main group of people that's working on housing, connecting with them, figuring out your role from there. But I think something that I would press is that any role, you know, we can only do this together. This is, you know, there's no silver bullet. There's no one organization that is going to be able to solve the housing crisis. And so I think your role is any way, you know, I've heard that you know, identifying your role is figuring out what your talents are, what your passions are, and where you spend your time, you know, figuring out your role fits somewhere in the middle of that. But I honestly, I would say that just starting somewhere, just starting that conversation, you know, you might not feel like you have the education or the resources or the financing or the time to do it. But I think taking that first step forward, engaging with local government, engaging with your housing nonprofits that are in your community is the first step. There's no wrong first step. It's kind of figuring out that first question, and then kind of forming that group. You can figure out, you know, that in that matrix, who plays what role. But I would say that business owners have just as much of a role to play as the city council. You know, employees have just as much of a role to play as landlords. You know, tenants and landlords both have to come to the table. It is truly a community housing issue. It's not a low-income issue. It's not a second home or a short-term rental issue. It's really a community fabric issue, like Leah mentioned earlier.
And I think it's important that if for us, whenever anybody in the community from a stakeholder group or an individual, you know, approaches us and says, is there a role for me in this? Is there anything I can do? The answer is always yes. That if there can be a role for everyone, and kind of the more we can make that inclusive, the more we can make this a social fabric issue. I love that phrase, because that is exactly what this is. In the short term, this is a housing economic issue. In the medium to long term, this is completely a social fabric issue.
Yeah, Jordan, and if I could just add one more thing, I think what's great about the conversation about roles and partnership frameworks and defining the issue is also for organizations to learn what their role is not. So I ran Mountain Housing Council for 3 years, and they're really good. We were really good at communications and bringing everyone together. We didn't do any implementation. The city is really good at taking the idea of like a long-term rental grant program and like implementing that program and writing the policy and the program guidelines and getting the funding and doing that piece. The city is not good at communications, and they're not good at being the neutral convener of groups of partners. So in another community I worked in, there's a very, and David, it's interesting how you talk about your collaboration is a lot easier. Actually, we're in places where there isn't a city or a county that's really dominant, like in Teton County. Jackson Hole is a very strong city, and it's a very strong housing program. It's challenging to collaborate there because you have a very strong partner that sort of owns all the whole problem, right? So it's been very challenging to build a partnership framework in that community because of that dynamic. In a place like Tahoe Truckee, where we only have one city and we're a region across 2 counties, Mountain Housing Council grew very quickly and easily because we have to collaborate because we don't really have any city seat or county seat here. So I think just clarity on what your role is not, and giving that up to, we're working with Whitefish right now on a city housing strategy plan. And the outcome of that is probably going to be, you all need to stop being the convener and you need to hand that over to an outside entity to bring the partners together. It can't be perceived as a city driven plan. So.
Thank you all. Yeah. Those are super, super great insights, and we're really excited to share that graphic too. Thank you so much, Seana, for sharing that with us. one thing that seems to sometimes get overlooked in conversations around affordable workforce housing is the sustainability of housing options. So including things such as the total cost of living associated with housing, so transportation and utilities and repair costs, and whether housing will stay affordable in the long run. What are your thoughts about this, and what should people pay attention to in trying to make tourism industry employee housing like sustainably affordable? Leah, would you like to take it this first?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jordan. I completely agree. You're absolutely right. Sustainability often gets overlooked when you're talking about affordable workforce housing, but it's so important. If you don't have sustainable approaches, then your plan isn't going to have a long-term impact. So for community rebuilds, we look at sustainability from a few different lenses. For our low and very low income families that we serve, sustainability often takes the form of affordability. So costs and ongoing monthly payments for our families. And so our organization has taken a really unique approach to try to cut costs for our families to make home ownership potentiality. So we use things like volunteer student interns. We use a self-help program for folks to be putting in sweat equity. So both of those things really decrease labor costs, which is a huge deal when you're talking about overall construction budget. We use simple architectural design to reduce design costs and encourage reusing of those designs. We incorporate natural building materials for a few reasons. They're very low carbon impact. So you look at sustainability from an environmental lens, but they're primarily for our families, they're really affordable. So that also kind of fits into that multi-lens sustainable approach. We use recycled, salvaged, and donated building materials wherever possible. So all of those things in conjunction bring down the cost of our homes for families. As far as things, even monthly payments, you mentioned utilities. We use a passive solar design, and so passive and active solar design. And so this brings monthly utility payments down to on average 15% or $15 per family, which is really incredible. Also, we use a USDA rural development loan program where on average a monthly payment is cost adjusted to their income. And so on average is about $850 of a subsidized loan. And that's a fixed rate loan as well, no money down. And so I know I mentioned the self-help program nature. We have homeowners contribute 100 hours per month into their build. And so that sweat equity is really saving on those labor costs as well. And so, I mean, all of these things, and to put it in a bigger picture, we stack a lot of our programs together. So we have the affordable USDA loans, we have internship, volunteers, self-help that decrease in labor costs. We have a passive solar design, so helping reduce those ongoing costs. And looking to the future, I know, Seana, you mentioned deed restriction. We're pushing for deed restricted houses for the workforce, for people who have lived here for 2 years. So when these homes potentially in the future get sold, it creates a sustainable approach for affordable workforce housing for our tourism industry employees. And so we think that's really exciting. And kind of aside from the sustainability piece too, the homes we build, they're really beautiful. Like just thinking about what you want your community to look like. They have adobe floors, blown cellulose or straw bale insulation. And so they're really gorgeous homes that make people feel cared for and make people feel like they are a part of our community. So kind of getting back to that, what you want your community to ultimately look like, and fostering that within your approach for whatever level you're working on housing.
That's awesome, Leah. And the model that you all have is replicable, right? For other areas across the states.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been running, for folks who are interested in it, we are running education courses, because we have a lot of folks from out of state or in state who are interested in making similar based kind of nonprofits in their locality. And so we had folks join us from different states just about a month ago to learn more about it. So it is very replicable, which is really exciting.
That's awesome. Thank you, Leah. Yeah, and I'd encourage you to throw in any links or, and especially for our audience too, this is just, there's so many facets to the work that they do, and it'd just be really interesting to kind of see if any of them resonate with your community, or just have interest in that. So thank you so much, Leah. So a question that is probably surfacing for many of our viewers is like, how do you fund this stuff? And so David, would you mind sharing your thoughts about this? And then we'll pass it on to other panelists.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. When I started in this position, I was surprised again and again at how many people around the West that we talk to that say money is not necessarily the answer. So funding is, but I make the point that funding can consist of things other than just money. The money absolutely is a requirement, but there are other resources that could be brought to the table in addition to the cash that's required. And that kind of goes back to that conversation about roles. And so looking around your community and seeing where the appropriate spots for people to contribute, whether it's philanthropy, individual, city, tax, any of those buckets for financial, but then also the non-monetary things that could be in the form of, land use policy or developmental review, or in our case, access to community water. Or resources like that may still be part of the process of developing residences for us to live in, but may not necessarily have to be financial. And then there's, of course, the traditional tools, the short-term rental fees, transfer taxes, developer exactions, inclusionary zoning, things like that unfortunately for us in Montana are mostly out of reach. So we're sort of forced to look a little bit at other factors besides just the finance. But I think that's the biggest point for me to take away in my first year, was how many people said that it's not just the money, and then the acknowledgement that there are lots of other resources to be brought to the table that need to be brought to the table that might not necessarily just be financial. The financial is absolutely required without a doubt, but there are other things that could be brought. For us, I like to joke that I'm all need and no asset, because I don't have a huge pot of money to bring to the table, but I do have a lot of other things. I can appear with developers to help grease the wheel in the county approval process, for example. I can work a lot more closely and a lot more credibly with philanthropy than some of the other stakeholders, for example. So things like that, where again, trying to align roles with resources and who can bring what's necessary to the table in addition to just the financial piece. And then the other part on the financial, I noticed there was a question about federal resources from the Western Governors Association. And I think part of that problem for us, we talked about sustainability and sustainable affordability. And I think there has to be a recognition that affordability from a cost of living standpoint is a picture that looks different in each of our communities. And it certainly looks different in resort communities. So one of the obstacles to federal funding for us is often our wages don't come in low enough. But the frustrating part is at the same time, because of the shape and the picture of how cost of living looks in our resort community, at the end of the day, the person who's working 2 jobs and is sitting on the couch wondering how they're going to eat tonight is feeling just as much anxiety at $22 an hour in a community where the cost of living is so much higher as somebody who might be living in an inner city at $15 an hour. That anxiety level is about the same because the other costs of living in that community are so high. But so many of the federal programs don't take that into consideration. So we're kind of excluded because of income limits and things like that from a lot of federal funding sources, because they don't really take into account cost of living, holistic cost of living instead of just wage. Yeah,
and I want to, again, I'm going to go back to roles. So when you're looking for funding and you're looking for, we don't have funding or we don't have money, I guess I would ask the question for what type of housing, right? And really at the end of the day, David's exactly right. Don't let money be the reason you think you can't do housing in your community. Our job, the people on this panel, we need to be we need to think of ourselves as farmers, and we're trying to till the soil to bring private investment to the table. We're never going to have enough money to develop housing projects are 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. I mean, yes, you can do small ones, but it's such an expensive and financially complicated thing that you need people, if you go back to roles, that are really good at putting the finances together for housing. And our role is to figure out what is it those people need who are brilliant at bringing the financial resources to the table. They need the land. They need policies to be friendly. They need an advocate and a friend to help them open doors for them to create relationships and partnerships. They need somebody to manage the deed restrictions once they come to play. They need someone to property manage. They need someone to help people get into those units and qualify. And so I think we get overwhelmed by the cost of housing, and then we think we have no money. And every single pot of money requires a unique set of messages and a pathway to unlock that money. So David brought up a great example of working with the water district on their pathway to unlock some of their resources they could come to bear, which is valuable to those private investors. And so I guess I would say is what is interesting. Yes. So Truckee was able to pass a TOT tax to create about $1 million a year for 20 years. That's amazing, but it is not going to build any housing. All it is a leverage point to bring in additional dollars. It's like a great consistent amount of money that allows us to go out and till the soil and get everything prepped to bring in the big dollars of private investment.
Thank you both. For the sake of time, it looks like we've got about 5 minutes before we'll wrap up the questions. So I'm going to kind of combine our last two together for each of you all as panelists. And so I think looking at the chat and some of the questions that are coming through, there is an interest in like, well, what are these resources? What does this toolbox actually look like? And so for each of our panelists, are there any key tools that you'd kind of encourage our audience members to focus on, or like where should they put their energy? And then also if there are any other nuggets of wisdom that you'd like to share with us or things you'd like to reiterate on this topic in particular, it'd be lovely to have you all go. And so may I have Kaitlin, would you like to go first this time?
Absolutely. Yeah. And kind of, well, I'll tie a bunch of different things together. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say my main focus is on deed restrictions. I also want to talk about, for funding, there are so many things that communities can do that is not just developing housing. I would encourage you to think about housing in your community as both preservation and protection of housing and also production of housing. There's a lot of funding needed for building new housing, but creating more of a variety of deed restrictions. So in Moab, we kind of have the opposite problem of David and Park City and a lot of like really expensive mountain resort towns. Our median household income is very low. We want our employers to be paying more. We don't want our employees living here to be in low income restricted housing. And so we're focusing more on deed restrictions that are just for primary residency and for active employment. Do you live in the community? Do you work in the community? We don't care how much money you make. We just want to keep the housing preserved for locals. And so even with the community land trust model, I think that model works really well for both preservation and production, because we're able to bring partners like Community Rebuilds who are bringing in USDA subsidy, other federal subsidy. We're putting deed restrictions on those houses, and so that subsidy stays with that house in perpetuity. So deed restrictions are, if I could suggest one thing to require more deed restrictions, require your local government to require deed restrictions for at least primary residency. Put a little bit of that responsibility back on developers to say, you know, we don't care, you know, build housing for locals. We're going to restrict them for locals. We're not going to income restrict them. But that's something that we've done a lot in the last 4 years in Moab, is we've created more local government policies to require developers to take a seat at the game and actually figure out pro formas that are going to work for our workforce, not just this affordable low income housing category. So.
And we just have a couple of minutes left. So yeah, for other panelists, any resources or just other nuggets of wisdom for us?
I'll be very brief. I know we only have a few minutes left, but kind of piggybacking on that from Kaitlin, another thing Community Rebuilds is really advocating for, being forward-looking, is we also hope to see high density housing overlays with 100% deed restricted workforce housing. And so we're advocating for that. We haven't seen a ton of movement, but that would be also very exciting. And just to end it on kind of a pep talk, if you are working on this issue, like Kaitlin said earlier, just ask those tough questions in your communities and start figuring out, you know, who the players are in your areas, and hopefully we together can keep working on this issue.
Yeah, I would just leave echoing that. I think very much so that it takes a variety of solutions, and I think to put the CLT or the Housing Trust or this organization, whichever version of that we're all with, in the position of saying, I find myself in rooms a lot with funders or community saying, okay, we've all agreed this is the problem, and you've empowered this organization to go figure it out. So I'm here to say, if we want to solve this problem, here are the things it's going to take, because they're slow and expensive, and they're not always the most palatable to hear on the first hearing. But that has to be the message. Like, you can't come to me and say you want an alternate solution, because what I'm here to tell you is, if you want to solve this problem, here's what it's going to take. And these are the things as a community we have to agree that we're going to embark on together. Because to sit here and argue about whether or not it's going to take those things is steps backwards, right? We have to acknowledge that this is what it's going to take. And to say no to any of these things is basically saying that you really don't want to solve this problem. And most people in the community actually don't feel that way. They really do want to solve the problem. So sometimes it's just a matter of leading that horse to that water.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for your suggestions, for your advice, for your inspiration. There's so many questions in the chat and the Q&A that are so incredible. For those of you that are tuning in, Liz just did put in a little plug. If there are questions that you weren't able to put in the Q&A, please do so. We may be able to get to those in our summary report. So speakers, I invite you to turn your cameras off while we wrap up everything. And thank you all so much for being a part of this really incredible session. Turning back to the audience, and kind of before we wrap up, I would love to take a moment to just sort of hear what our participants are taking away from this session. So we're going to go back to the chat, and you all have been really active on there, which is awesome. So I'm going to throw in our prompt here. We've also got it on the screen. What is one thing that you're taking away from this session? There were a lot of great insights that were just shared with us over this hour. Municipalities must be engaged. Collaboration is key. How to align resources with roles. How to reach common goals. Building community will, absolutely. Learning about deed restrictions. Yeah, other resources, things you may have come across. We're going to have a number of links and whatnot in our summary report to kind of guide you all further in these discussions. Yeah, and it truly takes a community to make things happen. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your participation. We do hope you all gained insight from this webinar and are taking away some concrete ideas for how you can engage with the Office of Tourism and benefit the most from their services. I wanted to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our website for future viewing. So we would love for you to spread the word about the session and about our past and also our future sessions too. I'm also going to put that link back into the chat for you all. And I also want to highlight that we have more coming up. So this is the 7th, like I mentioned, so we have 2 more. We would love to have you join us. Our next session will be on October 4th from 12 to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And our focus will be on creating pathways for high school and college students to work in the tourism industry. It's an important topic that we hope will help with the planning of a resilient and sustainable future for Utah's tourism-based industry and communities. You can learn more about that session and register for the event on the training website. And also a reminder that you can also just find those past session recordings on the website too. So please feel free to just watch them, look over them, look at the materials, etc. And also we want your feedback to help us make sure that future sessions meet your needs. So please look for, we'll be sending out an automatic survey. It'll just take a couple of minutes to complete. It'll be sent to your email after the session concludes. And we would just love to be able to hear about what insights you all have for us as we move forward in this training series. And so with that, I just want to give a final thanks again to our panelists, to our audience. You all were so engaging and wonderful. Thank you so much for joining with us. And we hope to see many of you at our training session on October 4th. Thank you all so much.